It is the autumn of 1944, and somewhere along the Siegfried Line, a German infantryman crouches in a waterlogged trench. He has not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. His boots have holes in them. The artillery has been relentless, and last week, two of his closest friends were killed in a counterattack that achieved absolutely nothing. He is exhausted, frightened, and, if he is honest with himself, beginning to wonder whether any of this is worth dying for. Then, floating down from the grey sky above him, something lands in the mud beside his boot. It is a newspaper, a British newspaper printed in German, with today's date on the masthead. He picks it up, and what he reads stops him cold. The front page carries photographs of bombed German cities. It carries reports of Wehrmacht divisions destroyed on the Eastern Front. It carries casualty figures that his own commanders have never mentioned. Figures so catastrophic they barely seem credible. And yet the detail is extraordinary. The names of the units, the dates of the battles, the exact locations of the defeats. How could the British possibly know all of this unless it were true? That newspaper was called Nachrichten für die Truppe, news for the troops. And it was, by almost any measure, the most effective piece of psychological warfare ever produced in the history of modern conflict. It was not a pamphlet. It was not a propaganda leaflet. It was a proper newspaper with proper journalism, produced at remarkable speed and dropped in its millions over German-held territory from the summer of 1944 right through to the final weeks of the war. And the Germans, for all their ingenuity and their formidable intelligence apparatus, never quite managed to counter it. This is the story of how a small team of journalists, printers, and Allied intelligence officers built a newspaper factory in the English countryside and used it to convince hundreds of thousands of German soldiers that the war was already lost. To understand why Nachrichten für die Truppe worked as well as it did, you must first understand the information landscape that German soldiers were living inside by 1944. It was, to put it plainly, a desert. The Nazi state had spent over a decade constructing one of the most comprehensive propaganda systems the world had ever seen. Joseph Goebbels and his Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda controlled every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every film reel, and every public poster in the Reich. Private ownership of foreign radio receivers had been made illegal. Listening to the BBC carried the risk of imprisonment, and the official German press, papers like the Völkischer Beobachter, had by 1944 become so transparently unreliable that even loyal soldiers had begun to discount what they read. The problem was not that German soldiers were stupid, quite the opposite. By 1944, most of them had been in uniform long enough to notice the gap between what they were told and what they could see with their own eyes. They had watched the army's retreat from Stalingrad, from North Africa, from Sicily, from Normandy. They had received letters from home describing the bombed ruins of Hamburg and Cologne and Dresden. They knew, at some level, that the official picture and the real picture were not the same picture. But knowing something is wrong is not the same as knowing what is right. What German soldiers lacked in 1944 was not skepticism. They had plenty of that. What they lacked was reliable, accurate, verifiable information about the actual state of the war, and that is precisely what the Allies decided to give them. The concept of dropping printed material on enemy forces was not new. Both sides had done it in the First World War, with mixed results. The standard approach was the leaflet. A single page, usually crudely printed, making strident claims and offering incentives to surrender. The Germans had produced millions of them. The British and Americans had too. And the honest assessment, by 1944, was that leaflets worked poorly. They were immediately identifiable as enemy propaganda. Soldiers burned them, ignored them, or used them for purposes the printers had not intended. A leaflet screaming, "Germany is losing the war," was easy to dismiss. It was exactly what you would expect the enemy to say. What Nachrichten für die Truppe understood, and this is the insight that made it genuinely revolutionary, is that propaganda which looks like propaganda is useless. The moment a soldier identifies a piece of text as an attempt to manipulate him, his defenses go up and the message fails. But a proper newspaper, with news, with sport, with weather, with photographs, with the entire aesthetic vocabulary of a trustworthy publication, is a different matter entirely. The operation was based at a facility called Aspley Guys, a village in Bedfordshire, roughly 80 kilometres north of London. The site had been chosen partly for its relative obscurity and partly because it was close enough to RAF Mosquitoes, one of the Special Operations Executive's primary airfields, to allow rapid delivery of finished print runs to waiting aircraft. The editorial team was assembled from an extraordinary collection of individuals. There were German-speaking British officers, many of them Jewish émigrés who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s and now found themselves in the peculiar position of writing propaganda aimed at their former countrymen. There were journalists recruited from Fleet Street who understood how a real newspaper was constructed and what made readers trust a publication. There were intelligence analysts from both British and American services who could verify facts and supply the raw material. The genuine, accurate information about German losses, German retreats, German failures. That would give the paper its credibility. The physical production was, by the standards of wartime improvisation, impressively sophisticated. The paper was printed on a rotary press capable of producing hundreds of thousands of copies in a single night. The format was deliberately modelled on genuine German regional newspapers. The typeface, the layout, the column widths, the masthead design. Everything was calibrated to feel familiar rather than foreign. It measured roughly 30 by 42 centimetres, a broadsheet format printed on both sides, with 4 to 6 pages per issue. The production cycle was startlingly fast. Intelligence gathered on Monday could be in print by Tuesday night, and falling from aircraft over German positions by Wednesday morning. This speed was not merely impressive, it was essential. The newspaper's credibility depended entirely on its accuracy and its currency. If it reported a German defeat that had happened 3 weeks ago, a reader might already know about it through other channels and assume the paper was simply recycling old news. But if it reported something that had happened in the last 48 hours, something the soldier hadn't yet heard about through official German channels, then he had to ask himself an uncomfortable question. How do the British know this before we do? The answer, of course, was that the Allies had broken the German Enigma codes at Bletchley Park, giving them access to German military communications at every level. But the soldiers in the trenches didn't know that. What they knew was that the newspaper seemed to know things, real things, true things, things that checked out when you compared them to what you could observe with your own eyes. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It genuinely makes it possible to keep making these. The distribution method was as ingenious as the production. Specially modified RAF aircraft, primarily de Havilland Mosquitoes, operating at low altitude under cover of darkness, would fly over German-held territory and release bundles of newspapers from modified bomb bays. The bundles were wrapped in paper bands designed to break apart at altitude, scattering individual copies across a wide area. Estimates suggest that in peak distribution nights, upwards of 1 million copies could be dropped in a single operation. Over the course of the newspaper's run, from June 1944 to May 1945, somewhere between 250 and 300 million copies were produced and distributed, though exact figures remain difficult to verify given the wartime classification of production records. German soldiers described finding the papers in fields, in doorways, on roads, in the rubble of bombed buildings. Some units were explicitly ordered not to read them. The order was, predictably, ignored. One post-war account from a former Wehrmacht corporal recalled his sergeant burning a bundle of copies in front of his platoon, lecturing them about enemy lies. And then, that same evening, finding a single copy tucked inside the sergeant's own kit bag. The psychological impact was documented extensively in Allied prisoner of war interrogations. Captured German soldiers, when asked about their morale in the weeks before surrender, repeatedly mentioned Nachrichten für die Truppe as a source of information that had shaped their thinking. Not because it had told them to surrender, it rarely did so directly, but because it had given them an accurate picture of a war they were losing, in a format they found genuinely credible. The Germans, to their credit, did not simply accept this without response. The Wehrmacht's propaganda division, recognizing the threat, attempted several countermeasures. They produced their own fake version of Nachrichten für die Truppe, printed in Germany and distributed to soldiers as an example of what Allied propaganda looks like. The irony was considerable. The German fake was so obviously artificial, so riddled with the overblown language of Nazi rhetoric, that it reportedly made the genuine article look even more trustworthy by comparison. The Germans also attempted to intercept and destroy aircraft during distribution runs. This was technically challenging, since the modified Mosquitoes flew fast and low, and identifying a newspaper-dropping flight from a bombing flight required resources that the Luftwaffe, by late 1944, simply didn't have. American Psychological Operations, the Office of War Information, and the newly formed Psychological Warfare Division had their own leaflet operations running alongside the British effort. The American approach tended toward more direct messaging, surrender appeals, instructions for giving oneself up, safe conduct passes. These had value, particularly in the final months of the war when German resistance was crumbling, but they suffered from the same fundamental weakness as all traditional leaflets. They were obviously from the enemy. They were obviously asking you to do something. A soldier's first instinct was to be suspicious. Nachrichten für die Truppe avoided this entirely because it asked soldiers to do nothing. It simply told them what was happening. It treated them, in other words, as readers rather than targets. And that distinction, subtle, apparently trivial, actually profound, is what made all the difference. The legacy of Nachrichten für die Truppe extends well beyond the Second World War, though its influence is often uncredited. The fundamental insight it embodied, that credibility is the only currency that matters in information warfare, and that credibility must be earned through accuracy rather than asserted through repetition, has shaped psychological operations doctrine in virtually every major Western military ever since. Post-war studies conducted by Allied intelligence assessed that the paper had contributed meaningfully to a reduction in German resistance in the final months of the conflict. Exact figures are impossible to establish, and historians rightly caution against attributing surrenders to any single cause. The collapse of German military morale in late 1944 and early 1945 had many fathers: battlefield defeats, Allied bombing, the failure of the Ardennes offensive, the terrifying advance of Soviet forces from the east. Nachrichten für die Truppe was one factor among many, but it was not a minor factor. The prisoner interrogations are clear on this. The newspaper reached people at exactly the moment they were most receptive, when the gap between official propaganda and lived experience had grown so wide that something had to give. It didn't create doubt. It gave permission to doubt. It allowed soldiers who already suspected the truth to confirm it, in black and white, in a format that felt legitimate. The Aspley Guys operation was quietly wound down in May 1945. The presses were dismantled. The editorial team dispersed. Most of the production records were classified and remained so for decades. The men and women who had built this strange, brilliant propaganda machine went back to their ordinary lives, journalism, academia, the law, without any public acknowledgement of what they had achieved. A few copies of Nachrichten für die Truppe survive in archives and private collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples. They look, even now, exactly like what they were designed to look like. A newspaper. A real newspaper. Professionally produced, carefully sourced, precisely targeted. Nothing about them announces their true purpose. Nothing about them announces that they were weapons. Return, for a moment, to that German soldier in his waterlogged trench in the autumn of 1944. He is still holding the newspaper. He is still reading. Around him, the war is making its familiar noise. Distant artillery, the groan of aircraft somewhere overhead, the particular silence of men who have stopped talking because there is nothing left to say. What he is reading is the truth, not a distorted version of the truth, not a partial truth designed to manipulate him. The actual, verified, accurate truth about the war he is fighting. He knows that cities are burning. He knows that divisions have been destroyed. He knows that the armies are retreating on every front simultaneously, that the Reich is contracting from all sides, that the promises made to him in 1939 and 1940 and 1941 have turned to ash. He did not learn this from a leaflet. He did not learn it from a broadcast. He learned it from a newspaper, credible, professional, calmly written, that arrived from the sky as if delivered by the war itself. Whether that soldier laid down his rifle the next morning, or the next week, or not at all, is something we cannot know. He is anonymous, a composite of 1,000 real men in 1,000 real trenches. But we know what he read, and we know that what he read was true. And in the long history of wartime deception, there is something almost paradoxical and deeply poignant about that fact. The most effective weapon of psychological warfare the British ever produced was not a lie. It was a newspaper that simply told the truth and trusted that the truth was enough. In war, it usually isn't. In this case, it was.